The Empire Windrush ship brought the first 400 Caribbeans to Tilbury docks.
Those first waves of immigration, the Caribbeans, were different because those people, like my parents, were steeped in the behaviours of the British.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't the Caribbean people's history. It was a piece of British history. The reason that we wanted to write the book was to say, stop pitying us, understand why we came here. And by the way, here is the hard part of it.
Feeling British amongst the Caribbeans, compounded by the war.
Again, I'll never forget, because I interviewed him myself, saying a group of them had joined up. They had learnt to fly bombing missions, and he said he saw one of his classmates flying into a hill, and he never came back.
And I'm very interested in trying to work out what it is that unites us all.
The left wants to change our society. In order to make people want change, you have to paint the current situation as though it... Identity is really, in my view, about the social services might have intervened, but they did not intervene because I absolutely saw red about this. It started me on a different path. Still, can you imagine?
Before you hear from Sir Trevor Phillips, I ask if you want to support this show, but all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Sir Trevor Phillips exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll get exclusive content, interviews, and ad-free viewing. But without further ado, Sir Trevor Phillips. Sir Trevor, thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to come and speak with me. You are, in my opinion, I think most people's opinion, national treasure. I've seen you on the telly since I was a kid, and we've spoken about your work at the Index for Censorship. I've just read your book, Windrush, The Irresistible Rise of Multiracial Britain, which is what we're here to discuss. Of course, you published this in 1998, 50 years after the Empire Windrush ship brought the first 400 Caribbeans to Tilbury docks, and you've done another edition, I believe, last year. Of course, not only does this mark the beginning of the Caribbean population of Britain, but also it symbolises, I think, post-war immigration to Britain from other nations, so predominantly the Asian immigration, and also there was European immigration as well. So I'm keen to get into it. The book is beautiful. I highly recommend it to listeners and viewers. Not only is it the history, but you go into the story of changing identity, not just for immigrants coming to Britain, but the British themselves. You look at the politics of it all and how various acts and legal things developed as a consequence. You look at race relations in Britain, but you also go before what led up to 1948, which I'm hoping to get into, particularly as I think so much of it is relevant to what Britain is going through today. We're still having, I believe, an identity crisis involved in part because of immigration. And I think that there's clearly, I don't think anyone would dispute, there's problems of social cohesion today. And and immigration, of course, is always remains number one or number two issue through Britain, has for a long time. So I'm hoping we can get into that. But perhaps before we talk about the story of Windrush, perhaps you can tell me your personal link to this story and why it's important to you.
Well, thank you, Winston. And it's I like the way you set this up. I should say that Windrush is co-written between myself and my brother Mike, who is he's a sort of proper full-time writer, writes thrillers, and has done very well out of that. But we, I think, wanted to tell the story of families like our own. And the reason we wanted to tell that story was very simply that we thought that people looked at us in a way that made us not the people we are, but something different. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. My parents grew up. My father was born in 1910 in what was then a British colony, and my mother a few years later. They were subjects of the empire. Now, there's a lot said about the empire and colonialism now, mostly by people who did not experience it. I was born, in the early 1950s. I spent most of my childhood in what was British Guyana, so I lived colonialism.
But you were born here.
I was born in London, but the story of my family is I'm the 10th of 10 children. My father he left school at 13 or 14. He didn't grow up with his own parents, very common in the Caribbean, for a whole range of reasons. His father was up country. He never really knew his mother, so he grew up with relatives. My mother met him in church, and that's kind of where we meet still, I think, most of us. And they got married. As I say, they had 9 children before me. My father worked in railways, worked on the docks, and he was in the army during the war. He was a quartermaster sergeant at a place called Mazaruni, which is way, I suppose, expression we would say in Guyana, bush, in the bush, or in the interior, i.e. way up country. And he worked in a prison colony, which is where they put Italian and German prisoners that they did not want.
This is in Guyana.
This is in Guyana, yeah. That they didn't want to get away. It's the equivalent of Devil's Island, that sort of thing. Anyway, after the war, my father came back. This was during the period of the stirrings of independence. India become independent in 1947. All over the Caribbean, there were people saying, it's time for us to look after ourselves and so on. The reason that I think that the story we wanted to tell is that right there, people will say that people come and they emigrate because they're fleeing war or they are desperate for jobs or whatever it was. In our family, that wasn't the case. My father could have stayed in Guyana. But actually, the person who really wanted to move actually was my mother. And my mother wanted to move because we lived in a small village, seaside village just outside the capital, Georgetown, and she wanted more. And the thing that the first point really about the Windrush story is that you have to kind of recalibrate your idea of who immigrants are. We tend to think of immigrants as poor, benighted, fleeing people. Actually, that's not true. Most immigrants are the ones in the village who are the ambitious ones. They're the ones who don't want to put up with life as their parents and grandparents experienced it. They are the ones who want more for their children. And that was true of my parents. And the reason that they came to England, I mean, the sort of very specific reason you could identify was that my eldest sister, she actually wanted to be a teacher, but it was colonial times, and there wasn't a possibility for her to become a teacher. Nobody would train her.
Mm.
But she could become a nurse because National Health Service had become a possibility, and it was ambition that brought her, not here. And she and my father came first, and the rest of the family followed. So the first point I really want to emphasize about Windrush, and the reason that Mike and I decided we wanted to write this, is that we just got fed up of people treating us as, victims of war, storm, and all that, who somehow washed up, bedraggled on Britain's shores. It wasn't like that at all. We came of our own accord because we wanted more. We had agency. So the reason that we wanted to write the book was to say, stop pitying us, think of us, understand why we came here. And by the way, here is the hard part, I think, for other people to understand. Once you start to think of immigrants in that way, what you begin to realize is that the ones who get here don't necessarily have to be nice people, but they are quite special people because they're very determined.
Mm-hmm.
They're very adventurous. They're ready to take a risk,
Yes.
which is why so many of them are successful.
Yes.
And some of them are, frankly, dodgy. But that's the nature of the immigrant.
Mm-hmm. Is that a reflection of the 90s when you say you were sort of fed up with being thought of as kind of fleeing war? Is it so? Is that the mood in the 90s when you were writing it? Because if it had been perhaps reading your book, if it had been 40 years earlier, the inspiration might have been we're fed up with the racism or the social issues. It could have been a different influence, right?
Well, yeah. Though I suppose I'll say two things about that. First of all, the racism and the desire to tell our story are in a way linked. I've worked in television now for 45 years, and when I was a kid, you hardly saw a black person on television. The joke wasn't, it wasn't really a joke, it was actually true. If you saw a black person on television, you'd shout upstairs and say, "Mommy, there's a black person on television." And they would then, go and knock on the neighbor's door and says, "Black man on television." And everybody in the street would be watching this person. Though by the time everybody got there, the man or woman had probably said their line in Z Cars or whatever drama it was and gone. But there was a sense in which we only appeared in British life in the 1970s and 1980s in very limited ways. Early on, it was because, we're criminals, or the women were prostitutes, or somebody had been involved in some strange episode. So, for example, one of the earliest people who became well known was a guy called Lucky Gordon, who was involved in the Christine Keeler and Profumo scandal because he had a relationship with Keeler, and he fired a gun outside.
So people might not know this. So this is a political scandal.
There's a political scandal in which essentially Christine Keeler was sleeping both with the then Minister for War, John Profumo, and a Soviet spy. And when it all came out, of course, Profumo's career was ended and so on. Anyway, the point was, black people only turned up in really usually quite scandalous circumstances, or where in the 70s or 80s we were rioting. And so there was an idea of who we were that came from that. And also because, our children by and large were unsuccessful at school, that was another kind of idea of who we were. And the problem is that, and it is still true, I'm afraid, that most people, if I walk through the door, if they don't know me, aren't thinking, "Oh, is this guy a doctor or is he a dustman?" They're pretty sure that I'm going to be a dustman because of what I look like. And it is true for most of us, most of our lives, that the color of our skin makes people think that they know exactly who and what we are before we've even opened our mouths.
I'm quite surprised to hear that you'd even feel that way today, because I mean, how do you know that? You can't read their minds, right?
Well, I'll give you give you a very simple and straightforward example. Relatively few people ever asked me to go on a program to discuss technology. I'm a graduate of Imperial College. I've got 2 degrees. I own a company that runs data analytics. But what people want me to talk about, and I'm happy to do this because I think I've got something to say about it, is about race and identity. Nobody ever asks me about AI. And I know quite a lot about AI. I spend quite a lot of money, of other people's money on it. And but it's not part of what people like me
That's quite a
are
different
about.
thing from people thinking you're a dustman.
Well, the point is, though, that not really. It is because it's simply that I know, and I've got used to it, because of the good fortune I've had in my life, it's not really a problem for me that people sort of think they know who and what I am and what I am supposed to think. I mean, one of the reasons I've sometimes get into various kinds of public issues is people go, but you're a black person, you're not supposed to think that thing. You're not supposed to be pals with Winston Marshall or whoever it happens to be because, do you know what I mean? People make
That's not my reputation.
I know people make all sorts of assumptions, and they are because they think that because I look like I look, I must think in a certain way. So my point is that during the 1970s and 1980s, I think some of us, not everybody, because some people done quite well out of being, victims of racism and telling that story. And I'm not saying it's not a real story. It is a real story, but it's not the only story.
Yeah, I understand that
us.
frustrations. And I've got other black friends who've frustrated that when it comes to politics, they're only ever asked. They don't want to talk about race at all, and it's the only thing they ever get asked about.
Oh.
So I appreciate that. That's something I've heard. Can we go to the history of Windrush a little bit? And in the book, you start before, and you've touched on your personal story there. Particularly interesting is the framing of the sense of identity of feeling British amongst the Caribbeans, particularly compounded by the war and their service during the war. Perhaps that's a good place to start.
Yeah. I think people don't know, and I guess to some extent, why would they? It's worth remembering that when my parents were born, as say, at the beginning of the last century, there was no status difference between somebody born into the British Empire in Georgetown, Guyana, from somebody born into the British Empire in Bolton, Lancashire. If you had a passport, it would be the same color. It would have the same inscription saying that the king requests that you should be allowed to pass wherever, and so we're all part of the same empire. We were all subject to the same crown. Now, of course, that didn't reflect. That was the formal reality, but that didn't reflect the actual reality in which, of course, we were all set equal, but some are more equal than others. When the war finished, there were a lot of men like my father who'd been in the uniform and who'd learned things, who'd become people who, to some extent, were of consequence, and they thought had shown that they could be responsible, that they could carry out work and tasks and lead, and were leaders of in their work. And a particular group of men who had come here when after war broke out, were very specific in their consciousness. We talked to a whole series of the Windrush voyages, of people who came on that boat in 1948. There were 492 people who they'd picked up in the Caribbean. The boat had come from Australia carrying troops. They went by the Caribbean, and there were spaces for people to come to London. There were a lot of men who had joined up during the war. One, Dudley Thompson, who I always remember him saying this. He later became Foreign Minister to Jamaica. So he had said that he would join the join the British Armed Services because he was in a dentist, and he picked up a book, and he started reading it, and the book referred to people, what we would now call people of color, as semi-civilized and ignorant and so on. And he read the book and he said, "Who is this?" The book, as it turned out, was Mein Kampf, and it was by one Adolf Hitler. And he said, "Well, I am going to go to England and kick Hitler's ass and come back home, because what right has he to say that kind of thing about me?" I mean, it's his story. But a lot of people who felt that they were part of the empire, that they had a stake in the freedom of the empire, who did not want to be under the heel of the Nazis, even if they weren't in Europe, came. And, it's now well documented that during the Battle of Britain, a lot of the engineers who kept the planes flying were Caribbean mechanics who'd come.
Mm.
Some of them died, and some of them were heroic. He's dead now, but flying officer, I think he was in the end Lieutenant Ulrich Cross. I think he flew something like 80 missions. Many were shot down. Some became prisoners of war. Many died. And in the book, one of the guys from Trinidad says that a whole class of them had volunteered. It's a thing that one has to remember. All these men came from small islands. They knew each other, and particularly for like the middle classes of places like Trinidad and Barbados volunteered. And I'll never forget, because I interviewed him myself for the film that we made that went with the book, of this chap saying that a group of them had joined up, they had learnt to fly, and then they flew bombing missions, and they also flew fighter missions. So most of the Caribbeans were navigators and bomber pilots. And he said he saw one of his classmates flying into a hill, and he never came back. And it's sort of quite, to be honest, just thinking about hearing it, remembering him talking about it now, it's heartbreaking. These were true volunteers. They didn't have to come. They weren't under any direct threat, but they believed, and they wanted to fight for freedom, which is very concrete. If you come from a background like I do, the idea of freedom is a very, very, it's not an abstract one, it's a real one, because my great grandmother was born into slavery, so the idea of freedom is not a kind of a thing that's written down in words. We know what it means. It means that, for example, in her case, she could be picked up from Barbados with a child that she bore, not because she was married to the father. That union wasn't a voluntary one, right? We understand what freedom is about. So all of this, I think, brought the men and women here to fight in the war. And after the war, the interesting thing, and comes back to the point I was making about who immigrants were, they went back to the Caribbean, and a lot of them were just bored. It was a backwater. Sugar, in Guyana's case, sugar and bauxite, the only industries. You could be a teacher maybe, but after London and fighting in the war and the adventure, you're 23 years old or 24 years old. You're going to go back to working on docks like your dad? No. So a lot of them, when they had the opportunity to get on the Empire Windrush, the fare was, I think, 28 shillings, something like that. Got the money together, borrowed it from their families and friends, got on the boat, and said, I'm going back to London. There's another story that goes around, which is, they didn't know what they were coming. They thought the streets were paved with gold and so on. Well, there might have been some naive people amongst them, but not many.
So, firstly, in what you're saying there, and their desire to fight for freedom, what's immediately striking to me about that is that they then would have thought that the British Empire was on the side of the righteous,
Yes.
which is completely contradictory to a lot of the radical progressive
I
thought
see,
today, where that there is nothing redeeming about the empire, let alone Britain, let alone the empire. That's sort of one change in thought. But one thing I found striking.
Well, by the way, that in a way is a point I was making earlier on about people who write about colonialism and empire who did not experience it, didn't live it. So just to give you a very small example of how this works, if you talk to some people now who write about empire, they would say, oh, you've got to change the names of things to expunge the history of empire. Well, I went to a school, as I said, I grew up in British Guyana, which became Guyana. I went to a school called Queen's College. It is academically probably the most successful school in the Caribbean. You get into it by passing exams, and historically it was started up in the 19th century for the children of expatriate civil servants and clever native boys, because it was a boys' school then. You would not, even now, dare to try to tell the alumni of Queen's College that they needed to get rid of the name Queen's College because it's monarchist and colonialist and so on. Because Queen's College doesn't mean oppression and monarchy to us. That's not what it means. What it means to us is the creation of our own best elite. Now, you can argue about elitism and so on, but if you come from the background that I do, you read that not as some sort of hierarchical thing. You read that as this is the place where we were able to show that we were as good or better than the white people. So you have to experience being in that situation for real to understand what these things mean. And I think quite a lot of people who talk about it don't understand what it means. It's all theoretical for them.
One thing I found interesting in the book is the change before and after the war. So when the Caribbeans came to Britain, firstly, some were surprised. There's testimonies of people being treated very well, that the Brits seemed to be so grateful that they were joining the war effort, and so were treated on a par. At least that's how I understood it. You should correct me if I'm wrong. And the other thing is, some people were shocked to have poor white people see poor whites in England, even poor whites begging from them. So it completely turned upside down their concept of racial hierarchy. That's during the war. But then it's quite a different story after the war. And so when after the Windrush starts bringing more and more Caribbeans to Britain, they're not given the same greeting necessarily. Am I right? Do you think that I've understood?
It's true to point. I'll tell you one of the most telling things that my father ever says about that period. He said, as the boats used to come in either to Southampton or to Tilbury or somewhere, and then you get on the train and come into Waterloo or Paddington. And he said the first thing that most surprised him when he came to England was to see a white man sweeping the platform at the railway station, because he had never seen that before. that would never have happened
Mhm.
back home. So he was surprised. On the other hand, we should not treat these people as though they were naive. I mean, they grew up in a colony, which was, in Britain's case, or the British Empire's case, there was no formal segregation, but there were things that white people did, and there were things that we
You
did.
said white people were running the place.
Exactly. So there wasn't a sort of, they weren't babies who were kind of clutching their pearls because that they were treated in some negative way. That was the way of things and what they expected. And to some extent, I think families like my own took the view that that's not our problem, that's their problem. That's how these people behave. They behave like that at home. We still call Guyana home. And they behave like that here. Should we allow that to get in our way of our objective, which is, in my family's case, my parents' idea was they would come here, they would spend a few years, they would work, they would make some money, and they would go home and spend it, building a new house, and they would create some opportunities for their children. So I think they were not naive. They knew that this was a cold country in more ways than one. They were familiar with discrimination. They were familiar with not being given a break. But because they were the people who came on those boats were as I said, the ones in the village who said, I'm not going to put up with this. They dealt with it. Now, I think what actually happened, and you're right to say there was a change. I'll tell you what I think happened. This is my own theory, as it were. During the 1950s, the number of people coming was actually, relatively speaking, small.
I mean, 400 would, in today's time, when we had 1.2 million gross migrants a couple of years ago.
Exactly. And even during the 50s, we were talking about 5,000 a year, people a year.
Although I know in hundreds of thousands of Europeans were coming on, I
later.
think.
Oh, really? After the war?
Yeah, after the war.
Oh, yeah.
And many thousands from South Asia as well. So
well, the South Asians came a bit later, but I think that the point I was really going to make is that for the most part, when the Caribbean migrants came here at the beginning, the assumption was always that they would go home. Everybody else thought that, and they themselves thought that.
Oh. So they were coming to make some money for a few years, have a bit of fun and adventure.
It was always a temporary thing.
Because it was predominantly men, wasn't it? Yeah.
At the beginning, it was predominantly men.
Yeah.
But then more women came. But what I think happened by about the early 1960s was that, of course, people started having children. And the children, like me, I mean, I was born in 1953, the children were going to school. And there comes a point at which, as a parent, as a family, you have to decide, what are we going to do? And most families, actually, I won't say got stuck, but it became, there wasn't necessarily anything to go back to, actually. And they thought some people started to get settled. They'd got jobs. They'd been able to buy houses.
Some of them were making good money.
Some were making decent money. And by the way, one of the things that happened for Caribbeans is that they got property because they couldn't get council houses. I mean, the families like mine would never be allowed into council houses, partly because there weren't that many, but also because on the estates nobody wanted black people on the estates. We lived across the high street from a big estate in North London, and let me just tell you what sort of people that were there. I had, like all kids, like all boys, I was part of a little gang. I was the only black person in that particular gang, 4 or 5 of us, and my friend, called Dennis, lived on that estate. And funnily enough, Dennis could come to my house and we would play all day, play football and all the rest of it. And we'd go home and Dennis would go into tea and Dennis's mum would stand at the door. I never saw the inside of Dennis's house. And it took me much later to realise that on that estate, there were no black people.
Mm-hmm.
And Dennis's mum would never even let me inside the house.
Mm-hmm.
So we were never, the reason that Caribbean people bought homes was because they couldn't get to rent. And we, just very small thing, we used a system, the Jamaicans call it susu, the Guyanese call it box, where essentially you'd put money into a little fund every week, and when somebody got the opportunity, they could take all the money and put a deposit down on the house. So it was a communal, like a little bank, but it was based on trust, because nobody would run away with the money, because if you ran away with the money, everybody back home would know that you were a thief and they would ostracize your family. So it was a really interesting thing about the way the community developed at that point. But the basic point is that there came a moment where families had to make a decision: are we going to stay? Or are we going to go home? And most stayed. My own family, interestingly, we split. My parents decided to go back to the Caribbean at the end of the 60s. And they went via America, and quite unusually, they got stuck in America. So, and I now have 4 sisters who live in New York, a brother who lives in Florida. We are now more an American family than we are a British family. But we were part of the group that went back, but that was a minority. Most just stayed. And that's when, in a way, your point about the impact of racism and discrimination really started. Because once you decided you're going to stay, the expectation is you're going to be treated like everybody else.
Right.
And at that point, it really matters.
Right. Okay.
Because you want your and the first big, if you like, scandal, and the thing that really, as it were, upset the Caribbean community in this country was a thing that came to light at the back end of the 1960s, the early 1970s, which was that black children were being put in educational subnormal, schooled for what were called at that point educationally subnormal, what we call learning disabled. And there's lots of material.
Even they weren't necessarily disabled.
Specifically because they weren't.
Right.
And actually, because they had accents that the teachers said they couldn't understand, and they said they were slow and so on. But actually, when this thing came out, it became clear that they were not being put in these schools because they were learning disabled. It was because nobody wanted them in the main classes. So, and you couldn't get a more painful and important issue for the Caribbean community, because bear in mind, all these families had come in order to better themselves and create opportunities for their children. So what would be the worst thing you could do? You could make it impossible for their children to succeed academically.
So would that have had more of an impact on the psyche, on their psyche, than, let's say, the 1958 Notting Hill riots or Nottingham riots?
Without question.
Really?
I know we talk a lot about the riots now, but I would say without a shadow of a doubt, the thing that most alienated and hurt the Caribbean community in the 60s and 70s was a treatment of their children and the feeling that whatever they did, their children would not be able to succeed.
One very interesting through line through the book and theme is that of identity, which we've touched on already. And obviously there's a change of sense of identity. Identity really is a metaphysical thing, and we've explored this on the show quite a bit. And you'll have been following in the national discourse. There's a conversation about what is it to be English, what is it to be British. When in the sort of late 40s, as you describe in the book, there's a sense of, in Britain, there are the English indigenous, and then there are the Caribbeans or the West Indians, and there's a sense of a difference of identity there. And you've also got happening at the same time is it changes in law. So you have the 1948, the Nationality Act.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there are Commonwealth immigration acts, and so it seems that there's a changing sense of identity. And I'm curious to get your insight into that and how that changed over the years.
Well, look, I mean, when people talk about identity, I think they can get a bit confused. I mean, to me, it's the question of identity is literally about a question. Nobody ever says, nobody walks into a room when they introduce themselves and say, I don't say, "Oh, I'm Trevor Phillips."
Can I reframe the question then?
No, I'm not criticizing your question.
Yeah,
I'm just getting to a point to explain why I think it's an issue. The reason identity ever becomes an issue is when somebody is asked, where are you from? Which is why that whole thing that happened recently, which was, to be honest, a trivial one about manners,
right,
more than some terrible racist, but it evoked a wider question. You're only ever conscious of a specific identity when somebody asks you, and most people feel it. For example, if somebody asks you for your passport, or what football team do you support, and so on. So you don't go about saying, "Oh, the first thing you need to know about me is I'm a Chelsea supporter, a Spurs supporter." That only comes up when somebody asks you. And I think for this issue of identity, racial identity, which is what we're talking about,
it's not actually what I'm talking about.
Oh, okay.
It's more national identity. This is why I want to maybe reframe it, because why I think it's so important is that we have today serious disunity and social disunity, and I'm very interested in trying to work out what it is that unites us all, because I'm not happy about the riots we're seeing. I'm not happy about the balkanization of Britain, which I think is actually happening. And so what I'm curious is finding what is it, the identity that unites us all, and perhaps before 1948 it was something to do with it was something to do with the monarchy, perhaps, or something to do with the empire, which we're in a different place today.
Okay, now I understand.
Sorry,
I understand. No. You're quite right too. And now I understand. Well, you don't look. I think that people can be. There's lots of writing about this, and I'm always a bit reserved about getting too far into it, because I think we can make it too complicated. Identity is really, in my view, about behavior, actually, more than anything else, and norms. And let me just explain that first, and then explain why I think something is going wrong, because I agree with you, something is going wrong. In the, as it were, the good old days, there were things that identified what British people were like. My father would say roughly 10 times a week, "Manners maketh man." Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because it says a number of things. It's Edwardian, it's provenance, it's a very English idea. The expression of it essentially comes from the King James Bible. So, number one, the reason that we had this similar identity is that we shared an idea of what our history was. What are the texts that are important to us? What are the things that make us stand up when a person of authority comes into the room or not? When I was much younger, it would be unthinkable for me, and it doesn't matter which part of Britain or the empire I came from, a man to walk through the door in front of a woman. Even now, I would find it awkward. These are the kinds of things that I think give you identity. They're not about, some abstract loyalty oath. They're about behaviors and what is normal. That's what makes the difference. I think what has become problematic for people, and here I know where I can see where you're pointing at this on this. I think there are a lot of things to blame, but if you were going to say, is there a sort of radical proposition that has created that problem? Well, I think it is. I think there is one. I think one of the problems that the left has had is that because the left wants to change our society, it does a thing that Freud said that happens. In order to make people want change, you have to make the current situation intolerable. So you have to paint the current situation as though it is evil and horrid. So basically, Britain has to be terribly racist in order so that people can be persuaded we need to do something different. And I think there's a left position which is now become a caricature of itself, in which everything about Britain and everything about Britain's past has to be evil, racist, oppressive, so that we can throw all of that off and enter this new Jerusalem. Now, politically, I think that's just asinine.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are many great things about this country. I think there are many wonderful things about the norms and the behaviors. And the central one, and that's why race and racism have become a big deal here. The central thing about this country that has made it, in my view, successful socially and to some extent economically is the Elizabethan idea of toleration. That is to say, we live in a country where we have certain codes of behavior that we all share and we all sign up to. And as long as we share, for example, rule of law, respect for other people's space and their property and so on, as long as we sign up to those things, then you can wear what you like,
Mm-hmm.
for example. I think that what's now happened is that there are people who don't like the tolerant character of Britain. They find it hard to imagine that other people will want to behave or raise their families, for example, in a different way to them. They think everybody ought to see the world in the way they do. And I think we're losing that core of tolerance. And that to me is what the identity problem is about.
Forgive me for being a bit slow here, but I'm not quite sure who you're referring to or like what.
Well, look, I mean, I think one of the big things, there are two areas where there have been challenges. One is on the issue of sexuality, sex, gender, and so on. Now, when I was in public office, I was responsible actually for some of the legislation that made it easier for people to transition. I believe that people, who want to be in a different body, provided it's not to somebody else's disadvantage, fine. What is not acceptable is for everybody, for some people, activists, to tell me that I must address somebody in a particular way. I must have pronouns on my emails and so on. The point about British toleration is that we believe as a country in people being able to live their lives as they wish, as long as they adhere to a certain core of respect and an acceptance of that other people can be different.
Mm-hmm. So the illiberal left is kind of what I'm getting from you.
The illiberal left is as good a way as describing it as any. And I'm there's no secret about this. I've been supposedly on the wrong side of this, both in relation to, for example, the trans issue, in relation to some issues of Islamism, for example. I just don't accept that I have to respect any belief or anybody's idea. I'm not going to respect somebody who thinks that women are second-class citizens.
Mm-hmm.
There's no universe in which I am going to pass that over. There is no universe in which I'm going to, and this is where, in recent times it's become a real issue, I'm going to accept that we may not say that a particular group, by which in this case it's Pakistani Muslim, Afghan Muslim men, have a disrespect for white families
Mm-hmm.
and treat their children in a violent and vile fashion.
Yeah. So let's explore this a moment, if we may, because one thing that's changed with regard tying this to immigration is that, and we definitely saw this after the 2024 riots, it's that the tensions now are more between, it's not necessarily indigenous English and other groups. It seems to be more like the culturally British, those who've been generations here, and new Muslim arrivals from specific countries as well. So what I found striking about, let's say, the riots last year was that there were Sikhs and black men amongst the white who were rioting, and so there's this sort of new, different dynamic that's come up, and obviously the rape gang scandal it sort of ties into that kind of narrative. Now, you were actually you were suspended from the Labour Party for over Islamophobia accusations. So this is clearly something you're not worried about calling out. I actually don't fully know that story, so I don't know if it's necessarily relevant to this conversation.
Well, it's very straightforward and very simple, and it goes back 20 years when I was chair of the Commission for Racial Equality. There was a terrible story of a little girl called Victoria Clambier, who was essentially tortured and murdered over a period of several months. She was from West Africa. She lived with people who were supposedly her relatives. Parents trusted them, but they absolutely tortured this child and killed her. And the inquiry that followed said that there were several occasions on which the social services might have intervened, but they did not intervene because they, in essence, I'm paraphrasing here, saw that some of the behaviors they thought that they regard some of the behaviors as characteristic of West African families, and they didn't want to interfere. And that was all in the name of what was then described as multiculturalism. I absolutely saw red about this, and it started me on if you like, a different path. I've always believed, the idea of toleration, we should be able to live together even with people whose ways we don't particularly like. But there are certain things that cannot be justified on the basis of cultural difference. And in any civilized society that I want to live in, must not be justified in that way. So the Victoria Clambier thing, where social workers said, "Oh, well, we didn't want to intervene," I even now, it was 2000 when that child died, 25 years later, and it's still, she lived 15 minutes walk from where I grew up. And can you imagine the awfulness of the actual experience of that child? And then for excuse me, I nearly went into football language there, the bureaucracy to use cultural difference as a reason to allow that child. My point is that as a society, you have to decide what kind of people you are. And we cannot be the kinds of people who have a kind of laissez-faire and an attitude that justifies maltreatment or injustice or inequality on the grounds that, well, they're like that. Because actually, you know where it comes down to, Winston, and this comes back in a way to the reason we wrote Windrush. That is the attitude of people who end up saying, well, yeah, black people, they go out and they stab each other and they rob and, they do all sorts of things, but they're like that. They're like that. That's what they used to say in the Empire. And I won't have it. See, all of these things are part of the same story. And that is one of the reasons that, as it were, I revolted against the doctrine of multiculturalism as it was practiced. And because it's also the doctrine that justifies segregation. Well, they're like that. And the point you wanted to make about Southport and so on. To me, it's all part of the same picture. We can't have different moral and social standards for different groups of people, and I think that, in a way, is what you're talking about when you're saying, have we moved from place A to place B because of immigration? In short, to some extent, you're right. And if I were to shorthand it, I would put it this way. Those first waves of immigration, the Caribbeans, and indeed some who came from Punjab and so on, were different because those people, like my parents, were steeped in the behaviours of the British. The things that they thought the things that they thought were important. And now, in our case, we spoke English and we were Christians. But actually, even if you were Sikh and Punjab, and you spoke a different language, and you had a different way of worship, you still understood what was thought to be decent and normal, and you lived by that standard. I think in recent times, something different has happened, and this is not just a matter of colour, because I think actually there are some white communities who have also departed from what I would regard as reasonable norms. One of them being, for example, that a very immigrant, and this is maybe a very immigrant point of view, you work for your living. You absolutely work for your living. You don't expect to be on benefit. And here's another one, which I think is a very, very potent one. There is no world in which my family would put an elderly person in a barracks, in a home, if we can avoid it. There might be some circumstances in which, for physical reasons, you've got to put somebody in care. But most people from my sort of background, when we talk about social care, the whole idea of shuffling granny or auntie off into a home where they're looked after by people they don't know, we don't know, we only see them once a month, if that, you'd be ashamed. Now, these are the things that I think really matter. And people slightly get mixed up about when they think about culture and race and all of that. The things overlap, but in the end, the issue of identity and what is British comes down to, what do you think is normal? What do you think is decent? What do you think is a good way to live? And that's what the fight is really about.
Yeah.
Sorry, you've got me on an issue I feel rather passionately about. It's not much to do with Windrush.
You've expanded my thinking on this topic. You're coming at an angle I hadn't properly considered before. And although I will say you've only made me more concerned about the situation that we're in, and we have far more problems than I even had appreciated. I appreciate that you've got to go, but is there perhaps a note of optimism that we might be able to tie things together?
Oh, gosh, yes. Look, my basic point, and coming back to the issue of why we wrote Windrush, was that I wanted to say, and okay, take this as a piece of terrible conceit on my part. I wanted to say, number one, our story is not some foreign story. And it's one of the things I slightly resent about all of the sort of, the kind of anti-imperialist, the kind of, woke historians and so on. They number one, treat the whole history as though it is a simple black, white negative. Number two, they treat the position and background of people like me as though it is non-British. So when they say we need to teach, the different kinds of history, the African kings and queens and all this kind of stuff. Well, why? Actually, the British kings and queens were my kings and queens.
Yeah.
Actually, and my parents' kings and queens. And in a way, they were actually more relevant to our background. Now, it doesn't mean they were all good, but that's what our history was about. So in Windrush, Mike and I, when we talked about it, always talked about it as restoring a thread in the tapestry of British history. It wasn't the Caribbean people's history. It wasn't the black people's history. It was a piece of British history that people had faded from the tapestry. And that was our aim.
It totally succeeded in that, by the way. That's why I would really recommend this book. It's an important part. It adds to the corpus of the
I'm
British
grateful.
history.
And by the way, one of the interesting things about it, and I'll get this on record as a slight piece of resentment, when you create a story, not when you create, we didn't create the story was there. But when you tell a story like this, you can forget about possessing it. Windrush was never our story. It was the story of the people who made it. And what's really interesting is the way it's spawned and become something completely different. Nobody remembers who actually came out with it. And I slightly resent it that it's now been attached to scandal, because actually the fundamental thing about it was I wanted to say these were very special men and women in our country's history.
Mm.
And we need to know them and honor them. And why do we need to know them and honor them? Because actually it tells us something important about the situation we are facing now when it comes to immigration. I don't think anybody in their right mind is going to argue that, I might be one of those few people, but there are very few people going to argue we need more immigration or bigger immigration numbers, or we need people to come faster. I don't think anybody in their right minds.
There's a couple, but that's for another conversation.
That's I think most people who are from an immigrant background would say that the thing they hate most is illegal immigration and cheats, because most of us had to wait, and we did it in an orderly way. I personally resent it because, for example, when I got married, my aunt couldn't come because of immigration restrictions, but that was the fact of life, and we went by the rules. And it's just hurtful in some way to see people who are cheating ruled when most of us try to do things in the right way, and we now get, as it were, tarred with the brush of people who are doing things illicitly. But the single most important thing I wanted to say about immigrants, and we wanted to get over about Windrush, is that they are, by and large, special people because they are the ones who, want to make the effort. They are the ones who want to do something special with their lives and for their families and for their children. And if they actually make it, they are usually the ones that are most resilient and most resourceful. And a good society ought to be able to use those people's talents and capabilities. What the thing that I really worry about, most population increase in this country over the next probably the next 6 or 7 decades will come from immigration. And we're not, I know that, there's a sort of Trump thing. We're getting the drugs and murderers and all the rest of it. And yes, there is illegal immigration. And yes, there are people who come and they're health tourists and so on. But for the most part, most of the people who come to this country have two important things about them. One is that they are smart and ambitious and they want to work hard. And secondly, they love this country. That's the reason they come here, because they really like what this country is. That is why when you look at the surveys, the people who are most hostile to legal immigration are not white people whose families have been here 8 centuries. It is the most recent wave of immigrants. So the point about Windrush is that we just need to rethink what we think about immigration. I completely go along with those who say what we don't want is immigration that disrespects this country's traditions and its values. I completely go along with those who say that there needs to be a conscious and properly organized and resourced integration effort. I completely go along with those who say, by the way, if you don't want to be here and fit in and do things in the way that makes this country what it is, then you better go and do it somewhere else. I'm very hawkish on that. But in the end, just bear in mind that the people most of the people who come here from elsewhere aren't slackers. They come because they want to do well for themselves, for their families, and for the most part, for this country.
So Trevor, thank you so much for speaking with me. I promise that I'll never again ask you about Windrush, and if you come back on, I'd love to talk to you about technology.
No, not at all. I'm so grateful to you for giving me the opportunity. By the way, we only use titles in our house when accompanied by a horse. And a damsel in distress, obviously.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Sir Trevor Phillips. If you want to support this show, remember, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Sir Trevor exploring issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you will get exclusive content and ad-free viewing. But until next time, be well.